As I will explain, against a backdrop of elevated inflation and a strong labor market, our policy has been adapting to the evolving economic environment, and it will continue to do so.
The Fed was far too late to acknowledge that inflation was picking up, and it's acted far too modestly to bring that inflation back down after recognizing that it was high. So primarily, we're dealing with a monetary policy-induced inflation, and we need a monetary policy solution to correct that. We know how to conduct monetary policy reasonably well now. We had very high inflation in the 1970s, and at that time, there was a lot of debate about whether the Fed could bring down inflation. Not whether it should, but whether it was capable. And Paul Volcker basically eliminated those questions. He made it very clear that the Fed can bring down inflation. It can be painful when the Fed brings down inflation very quickly, but the Fed can bring down inflation. So the monetarists will say that he cut the growth rate of money, and the new Keynesians will say that he jacked up interest rates. But effectively, what he did and what the central bank needs to do today is communicate to the public that the Fed is primarily focused on delivering price stability and then slowing the growth rate of money in order to bring nominal spending growth back down. There's some debate about whether it needs to be looking at monetary aggregates when it's doing that, or whether it needs to be looking at interest rates. But there is basically no debate that the objective is to slow nominal spending so that inflation will come back down. If the Fed committed to that, they could bring inflation back down to 2%. By the end of the year. That's not out of the realm of possibility. But it's also not what the Fed is projecting that it will do. Instead, it's projecting that inflation will remain elevated this year and next year and even a bit in 2024. So they are plotting out a very long course.
Before I go into the details of today's meeting, I'd like to take this opportunity to speak directly to the American people. Inflation is much too high, and we understand the hardship it is causing, and we're moving expeditiously to bring it back down. We at the Fed understand the hardship that high inflation is causing. We're strongly committed to bringing inflation back down, and we're moving expeditiously to do so. We have both the tools we need and the resolve that it will take to restore price stability on behalf of American families and businesses. We have both the tools we need and the resolve that it will take to restore price stability on behalf of American families and businesses. The economy and the country have been through a lot over the past 2 years and have proved resilient. It is essential that we bring inflation down if we are to have a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. The economy and the country have been through a lot over the past 2.5 years and have proved resilient. It is essential that we bring inflation down if we are to have a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all.
And so today, you still see in the political sphere people casting blame at politically unpopular targets. They'll say that inflation is driven by greedy corporations, or they'll describe it as Putin's inflation. And both of those ideas are suggesting that this is really out of the Fed's hands.
President Biden accusing the oil industry of profiting from the record high gas prices. That from an open letter to 7 of the biggest oil companies. The president wrote that historically high refinery profit margins being passed directly on to the American families are not acceptable.
Here's the final 2 lines of the letter. Vladimir Putin's price hike, which price hike are both capitalized. I'm not sure why, but Vladimir Putin's price hike, all caps, are driving up costs for consumers. I appreciate your immediate attention to this issue and your efforts to mitigate the economic challenges that Vladimir Putin's actions have created for American families. So Putin's mentioned it 5 times, I think.
We have seen in the past that the Fed is capable of bringing down inflation, particularly when it's nominal spending driven inflation like we're primarily experiencing today. So a lot of those doubts that we had in those earlier periods, we should not have those doubts today. We have experience today, and we know that it can be done. It's just a question of whether or not this FOMC has the will to do it. And unfortunately, the longer they delay and the slower they act, the harder it is to bring down inflation without causing a big recession. I think there's a very good chance that we're already in a recession. We saw a real GDP decline in the first quarter of 2022, and we've seen a lot of supply disturbances in the time since. These supply disturbances make it harder to produce, and so that is likely to bring down GDP a bit as well. And so I would not at all be surprised if, when the data comes out, we find that we've had negative GDP growth for the first 2 quarters of 2022. That, as a rough rule of thumb, is what economists describe as a recession. That is, there's absolutely no reason to think that we have to experience a sharp, long-lasting recession, on the magnitude that we experienced in 2008. The only way we would get a big economic contraction like that is if the Federal Reserve responded to this inflationary crisis by with a very sharp contraction in monetary policy. And so we got to recognize that Fed officials they've put themselves in a difficult situation here, where on the one hand they need to bring down inflation, but on the other hand, if they try to do that too quickly or without enough forward guidance, they can overcorrect. And if they overcorrect, they can send the economy into a very steep recession. Now, I expect they're going to try to err in the opposite direction, and what that means is that inflation will persist. It will remain elevated for much longer than I would like. But we should recognize that there's this risk of a sharp contraction if the Fed overcorrects.
From the standpoint of our congressional mandate to promote maximum employment and price stability, the current picture is plain to see. From the standpoint of our congressional mandate to promote maximum employment and price stability, the current picture is plain to see. The labor market is extremely tight and inflation is much too high. The labor market is extremely tight and inflation is much too high. Against this backdrop, today the FOMC raised its policy interest rate by 0.5 percentage point. Against this backdrop, today the Federal Open Market Committee raised its policy interest rate by 0.75 percentage point and anticipates that ongoing increases in the target rate for the federal funds rate will be appropriate, and anticipates that ongoing increases in that rate will be appropriate. In addition, we are beginning the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. In addition, we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. I'll have more to say about today's monetary policy actions after briefly reviewing economic developments. I'll have more to say about today's monetary policy actions after briefly reviewing economic developments.
Certainly, politicians are always interested in spending money, and in particular, spending money in ways that will improve their reelection odds. But we have a central bank that is supposed to be independent from the fiscal arm of government, precisely to counteract that natural tendency to spend beyond your means. The central bank is supposed to be narrowly focused on providing that price stability, to not monetizing the debt, to not printing money so that the government can spend more than it raises in tax revenues.
Evidence clearly shows that when the central bank is independent from political forces, it tends to make good long-term decisions. Because the decisions that monetary policy makers make have long gestation periods. They take a long time, longer than a politician is often willing to wait.
But unfortunately, over the last 2 years, the Fed has largely accommodated the fiscal expansion, and it hasn't really changed course very much, certainly not to the extent that was warranted, even after it realized that inflation was way too high.
I mean, that's what the Build Back Better Act is all about.
We're really excited about what this means in terms of accelerating that all-important transition for our climate, and we're going to continue to work to make sure that it is accessible and affordable to all.
Federal Reserve Board members are selected by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And so they weren't selected at random. We shouldn't expect them to have the typical view on inflation. Instead, we should recognize that their views on inflation is probably part of the reason why they were selected. And, for better or worse, politicians like to spend money, and they like to have their budget constraint relaxed with easy monetary policy. And so they have a tendency to select central bankers who are okay with a higher rate of inflation than the typical person is okay with. And as a consequence of that, we're getting higher inflation than the typical person wants. So when we're thinking about the big error that was made, there's the salient thing, which is that the government spent a lot of money and the Fed accommodated those fiscal policy expenditures. And that's certainly true. But that's also much easier to excuse, in my mind, because of the situation that we were in at that time. What's much harder to excuse is how long it took the Fed to realize we had an inflationary problem and how long it took to respond even after it realized we had that inflationary problem.
We were highly attentive to inflation risks and determined to take the measures necessary to restore price stability. The American economy is very strong and well-positioned to handle tighter monetary policy. To conclude, we understand that our actions communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. The committee has not made decisions regarding the specific timing, pace, or other details of shrinking the balance sheet. And we will discuss these matters in upcoming meetings and provide additional information at the appropriate time. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Federal Reserve will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals.